on civilians and civilian institutions are war crimes or crimes against humanity. Prior to the current assault, Palestinians had been living for 16, now 17 years under an illegal Israeli siege of the Gaza Strip, and now 56 and now 57, now 56 and now 57-year occupation. The International Court of Justice recently confirmed in an advisory opinion that Israel's occupation of the Gaza Strip, along with the West Bank and East Jerusalem, is unlawful, violating Palestinians' right to self-determination, a right enshrined in Article 1 of the United Nations Charter. While occupation is legal under the Geneva Conventions, which most countries in the world, including the United States and Israel, are signatories to, occupation is understood to be temporary and has additional responsibilities and obligations incumbent on the occupying power. Israel has undertaken its actions in retaliation to the Hamas attacks on October 7th, 2023. Hamas, a Palestinian militant group and the governing authority inside Gaza, breached what Israeli leaders considered a, quote, iron wall of defense and killed 851 Israeli civilians and 368 Israeli uniformed individuals, including soldiers, police, and security guards, according to Israeli reports. They also captured approximately 250 Israeli hostages. Since October 7th, thousands of Israelis have been injured and some 100,000 Israelis have been internally displaced. Almost half of the hostages were released during a temporary truce in November 2023. The Israeli newspaper Haaretz has long blamed Prime Minister Netanyahu for his refusal to end the war and bring the hostages home. Human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch, have called the Hamas attacks on civilians and the capture of civilians war crimes and crimes against humanity. Indeed, the International Criminal Court has found it has jurisdiction to charge both Hamas leaders and Israeli government officials with atrocity crimes, and the chief prosecutor has requested arrest warrants for 5 men, 2 Israeli and 3 Palestinian. If the ICC reaches a decision to issue arrest warrants, only the Israelis, Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, have reason to be concerned, as Israel has allegedly assassinated the 3 Palestinians cited in the prosecutor's request for arrest warrants. Here in the United States, concern rose quickly in October 2023 over the harm done to Israel and Israeli citizens. President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken immediately traveled to Israel to offer U.S. support. For over 50 years, the United States, under both political parties, has provided unrivaled military, financial, and diplomatic support for Israel. The latest report, published by the Cost of War Project at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, notes that while, quote, Israel is the largest cumulative recipient of U.S. aid since World War II, the amount of assistance approved during the past year, $17.9 billion, is substantially more than in any other year since the U.S. began granting military aid specifically to Israel in 1959. The U.S. government has dismissed critics who say that the Biden administration is violating U.S. laws, including Section 6201 of the Foreign Assistance Act, which forbids recipients of U.S. arms transfers from blocking U.S. humanitarian aid to populations in need. In fact, both the U.S. Agency for International Development and the State Department's Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration concluded in reports a few months ago that Israel is blocking U.S. aid to Palestinians in Gaza. On September 24th, just over a month ago, Secretary of State Antony Blinken rejected the reports of his own experts on the issue, diffusing the possible trigger of this and other U.S. laws. But clearly concerned about the worsening situation for Palestinians in Gaza, on October 15th, the Biden administration sent Israel's Minister of Defense and of Strategic Affairs a letter calling on Israel to reverse, quote, the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza, end quote. Secretaries Blinken and Austin have granted Israel 30 days to address this, or U.S. military aid could be in jeopardy. Politico followed this with reporting from a top US official on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Her name is Lise Grand. Grand is reported to have said that the US would not delay or stop weapons shipments to Israel because of the close relations between the US and Israel. For a deep dive into what makes all of this possible, folks can read the recently published book, Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic by Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, or the now classic, The Israel Lobby and US Foreign Policy by University of Chicago political scientist John Mearsheimer and Harvard University professor of international relations Stephen Walt. On college campuses, excuse me, on college campuses over the past year, many students have made clear that they do not want their government or their university administrations to support Israel's unrelenting assaults on Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, assaults which are also taking place in the West Bank, where over 700 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th. The number of Palestinians killed by Israel has been too high for college students. The number of Palestinian civilians institutions destroyed, too many for college students. Like the college students of the 1960s and 70s, whether protesting for civil rights or an end to the Vietnam War, or the college students of the 1970s and 1980s protesting against apartheid in South Africa, today's college students see injustice and they respond. They call for an end to what they see as genocide inflicted on Palestinians by Israel. Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim students have joined with Jewish students and students of other ethnic and religious backgrounds to tell their universities that they want life preserved and that they don't want their educational homes to support companies that participate in the most traumatic issue of their generation. Well, that along with climate change, of course. Universities across the country have responded by destroying peaceful encampments, suspending students, and creating new policies in an effort to thwart students from protesting an asymmetric war that, according to a preliminary decision by the International Court of Justice in the case South Africa raised against Israel, can plausibly be seen as a genocide. The response at universities across the country has seemingly been repressive and violent, leading the American Civil Liberties Union, Amnesty International USA, and Human Rights Watch to send a letter to university and college presidents and administrations just last Thursday, imploring them to respect and protect the right to protest under the First Amendment and other international human rights law, including the right to freedom of peaceful assembly. So I appreciate that our university allows us to do this. Much of the hostility has fallen on pro-Palestine student demonstrators. In a recently published article in the journal Social Movement Studies, titled Protests in the United States on Palestine and Israel 2023-2024, the co-authors argue that pro-Palestine demonstrations have far exceeded pro-Israel demonstrations in the US because the US government is meeting the views of pro-Israel Americans with its firm backing for Israel, while the US government is not meeting the views of pro-Palestine Americans who have been attacked as pro-Hamas and anti-Semitic. Those lazy but frequent criticisms occur as the evidence against the evidence which shows that pro-Palestine students and protesters are anti-war. As the co-authors of the Social Movement Studies article note, quote, "We've seen far more violence directed at people protesting for Palestinian liberation or against genocide than we've seen from them." That article just came out in the last couple of weeks. With the words of loud-speaking donors in their ears, government officials and university administrators across the country have targeted students, including large numbers of students from minority populations, which I think we can all agree are not students with much power or many resources behind them. Elected officials, university administrators, and even faculty colleagues have attacked students, but also professors who speak out. Lobbying groups have targeted politicians who have dared to criticize Israel's relentless violence and violations of human rights, seeing only one violator of human rights here, and that is the Palestinians. In short, the question I have posed to our speaker for his presentation is weighty. Do human rights matter? Our speaker, Omar Shaker, is well positioned to address this question for us tonight. Before I introduce him, I want to mention that if anyone wants the citations of any of the reports and studies I mentioned, feel free to reach out to me in the history department, where we thrive on evidence and citations. Omar Shaker serves as the Israel and Palestine Director at Human Rights Watch, where he investigates human rights abuses in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, and has authored several major reports, including a 2021 report comprehensively documenting how Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution against millions of Palestinians. As a result of his advocacy, the Israeli government deported Omar in November 2019. Prior to his current role, he was a Bertha Fellow at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where he focused on U.S. counterterrorism policies, including legal representation of Guantanamo detainees. As the 2013-2014 Arthur R. and Barbara D. Finberg Fellow at Human Rights Watch, he investigated human rights violations in Egypt, including the Rabat massacre, one of the largest killings of protesters in a single day. A former Fulbright scholar in Syria, Omar holds a Juris Doctorate from Stanford Law School, where he co-authored a report on the civilian consequences of U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan as part of the International Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Clinic. He also holds an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown University School of Foreign Affairs and a BA in International Relations from Stanford. Please join me in welcoming Omar Shaker to Towson University and for sharing his professional work on this important conversation.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, for that kind introduction. It is really such an honor to be here with you all. When we agreed on the date for this event months ago, I really didn't remember that tomorrow is the elections. So as I was getting ready to come here, I wasn't sure what kind of turnout we would have, but it's so wonderful to see the room filled and to see what look like many students in the audience. And as was stated in the introduction, I'm really looking forward to having a conversation. I'm gonna try to answer the question as best as I can and offer some observations, but this really is a forum for discussion. I hope you won't be shy to ask questions. I'm actually currently on parental leave and sabbatical, so I've been a little bit away from the day-to-day work, which has given me time to think bigger picture, and I think some of that will come out in my remarks, but I also am really excited to be in conversation with all of you. So what I want to try and do is answer the question that was put to me as best I can. It is indeed a weighty one that I've and many others have thought a lot about. And I'm going to give a short answer, and I'm going to sort of structure my remarks around sort of 4 trends that I think are happening at the same time. And when we put them together, I think will help make you understand how I see the answer to that question. So I think it won't surprise anybody that the short answer is yes, human rights do matter. I do work at Human Rights Watch. I am a human rights lawyer. But what I will say is the extent to which they matter, and the extent to which they matter not only in Israel-Palestine, not only in the Middle East, but I would posit far broader and much more broadly across the international community, hangs in the balance. And really the fate in many ways of not only international law, but the institutions charged with defending the rules-based international order are very much hanging in the balance. And so far, they've failed. I mean, you were just reminding me in your introduction about events that took place. I mean, the ceasefire was a year ago. I mean, just to think that I would be here today speaking to you in this, the atrocities, the bodies would continue to be piling up this far into something I could not have fathomed. So let me start with those 4 observations. And again, I'm going to structure my presentation around them and help you understand where I'm coming from in the answer I just provided you. So I'm going to say the 4 observations in one line, and I'm going to go through each one part by part, mostly focusing on the middle 2. So 4 things are happening at the same time. And that's why I think the human rights matter, but at the same time, their fate in Israel-Palestine much more broadly hangs in the balance. The first point that I'll talk about is the rallying around of the rules-based international order in light of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. Secondly, the unprecedented nature of the atrocities in Israel-Palestine. Third, the unique and unprecedented developments when it comes to international criminal law and international law on Israel-Palestine. And the fourth will be the global consensus, especially in the global south, around the nature of Israel's rule over Palestinians. So let me go through those one by one, and then I'll kind of conclude by putting them all together. The first trend that's happening, again, four things happening at the very same time, creating this moment that's putting the rules-based international order, really the fate of it in the balance. The first is the defense of the rules-based international order. I think it's hard, maybe to take yourself back to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But what we saw in a very unique way was the world globally, led by the West, rallying around the rules-based international order. That was the rallying cry to push back against Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So you saw states, the European Union, the United States, but much more broadly, going to the United Nations, funding the International Criminal Court, talking about the need to respect international humanitarian law, talking about the need, the right of people to defend themselves, talking about the perils of long-term permanent occupation annexation. So this was taking place before October 7th, but it created the precedent for what we see today. So I think that defense of that rules-based international order, and by the way, it's not unique, although it was mostly focused on Russia and Ukraine, we saw the same thing happening in Myanmar, where you saw, again, states going to the International Court of Justice, for recourse. Syria at the same time. You saw proceedings under the principle of universal jurisdiction taking place in Germany against Syrian regime officials that were involved in very serious abuses. Now, this resort, of course, has happened historically, right? We've seen moments where human rights was used as justification for action globally, but I posit that when it happened in Europe, when it happened at the doorsteps of Europe, there was a degree to which the world rallied around and put money and backing behind the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, and those very institutions. So that first trend is significant because it does show, in a sense, that human rights mattered, right? That was, in many ways, the rallying cry and the cause of action when it came to Russia, Ukraine. So that's number one. So the second point I want to get to then is the situation in Israel-Palestine. And I want to start with October 6th, 2023, because for many of you probably, especially those of you that are students, probably October 7th in the last year has been your entry point into the really detailed conversation about Israel-Palestine. But if I was giving this very same lecture on October 6th, 2023, I would have started with some basic facts about the situation in Gaza. And several of these points Kimberly made in the introduction, but I think it's worth reiterating. So Gaza is a part of the occupied Palestinian territory. So Gaza and the West Bank legally are part of one single territorial unit that is recognized by not only every country in the world, the UN, even Israel in the Oslo Accords recognized the Gaza and the West Bank as a single territorial unit. As again was noted in the introduction, the Gaza Strip has been under a closure policy since 2007, right? So what does that mean? That means, again, this is all before October 7th. I want to keep repeating that point so you understand what took place on October 7th and thereafter. And again, we'll get in. 17 years, Gaza has effectively been under a closure. What does that mean? It means nobody in, nobody out, unless you fall within a narrow band of humanitarian exemptions, right? So I'll give you an example. I manage a colleague, our Gaza researcher, who's based in the Gaza Strip, a young, talented, educated woman who had not left Gaza. She was 31 years old at the time. She had never left Gaza until several years ago, where he managed, pulling a rabbit out of her hat to get her a permit to leave. Now, the closure policy is a generalized ban on travel. It's not a case of, well, this person has a security ban, that person can go. Nobody can go unless you fall within these humanitarian exemptions. Like you need a life-saving surgery, you might be able to get a permit. Maybe you need to, go for, you have a first-degree relative who died. You want to go to the funeral. Very narrow exemptions, but the very same person, like my colleague when she was allowed to travel, who was able to travel once, might not be able to do so a week later, even though they've been security cleared because it's a generalized ban on movement. So you had that as a backdrop. Human Rights Watch has called that unlawful. It violates the right to free movement. There's no possible security justification to locking 2.2 million people. And let's remember, 25 by 7 miles in an open air prison. You should be able to move between Gaza and Ramallah, a single territorial unit, the way you might move between, I don't know, Towson and Washington, D.C. But in reality, that has been blocked for the people of Gaza. And it's not just a movement of people, it's also movement of goods. There has been sweeping restrictions on what goods can enter Gaza. The first, 2007, 2010, the Israelis calculated the average caloric intake for the population, and that was the basis by which they let in some goods. And that shifted in 2010, but still very much many goods under the dual-use policy, if they could possibly be used for military purposes, were not being allowed in. But that meant concrete, but it also meant everyday items, for hospitals, et cetera, that were not allowed to enter. And that led to the economy being in shambles. Gaza's GDP per capita from the early 90s until 2016 to 2021 had gone down. 80% of the population relied on humanitarian aid. The unemployment levels were nearly 50%, especially young people. So again, Gaza on October 6th was in a situation of unlawful closure, sweeping restrictions on movement and goods. Not only that, Gaza not only had the 17-year closure policy, but it's been under Israeli occupation since 1967. This is an occupation defined by systematic human rights abuse, by structural repression, by unlawful killings, etc. So closure policy, separating Gaza from the West Bank, from the outside world, in addition to 50 plus years, 60 is around the corner of occupation, which, as again noted in the introduction, the International Court of Justice recently found that occupation to be unlawful. I'll get into that a little bit more later in my presentation. In addition, the majority of Gaza's population are refugees or the descendants of refugees from the Nakba, from 1948. So the majority of people who live in Gaza today actually were displaced there, or are the descendants of those displaced there during the events of 1948. So again, you have 70 plus years of refugee status for the majority of the population, 50 plus years of, according to ICJ, unlawful abusive occupation, 15, 16 years of closure. Also, after the closure policy began, there was a divide between the two Palestinian political parties, Fatah and Hamas. Hamas largely seized control of Gaza in 2007. Hamas rule has been defined by their own repression, intolerance of dissent, rounding up and torture of dissidents. So that was the reality in the Gaza Strip on October. Oh, and I forgot maybe a very big one, which again was noted in the introduction, which is Human Rights Watch and many others, I'll get to this later, have found that Israel's treatment of Palestinians amounts to the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. That was an assessment we made before October 7th. So, and again, I won't do a whole lecture on how we made that determination, but the 2-minute version of the story is we and many others studied the ways in which Israel treats Palestinians. We did case studies comparing the treatment of Palestinians and Jewish Israelis living in nearby communities. We looked at years of data, and we documented the endemic discrimination and repression that takes place. And we weighed it against the law. Apartheid is a legal term. It's defined under the Rome Statutes, the International Criminal Court. There's a convention on the elimination of apartheid. It basically, what it means in layman's terms for the non-lawyers, is inhumane acts or really serious abuses when they take place in the context of systematic oppression with an intent by the oppressing party to dominate a group of people for the benefit of another group of people, right? So inhumane acts, systematic oppression, and an intent to dominate. So when we evaluated the facts, the evidence, of Israel's treatment in those case studies, we found that all three of those elements were there. That the Israeli government has pursued a policy to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians across the board, and that manifests in many, many, many different policies. To take one of many examples, for example, Jewish Israelis can marry people from virtually anywhere in the world and give them long-term legal status to live with them in Israel, but not if you're a Palestinian from the West Bank and Gaza Strip. It's effectively impossible for an Israeli married to a Palestinian to give them legal status to live with them in Israel proper. Many, many other examples, of that policy. There's been a long-term policy to maximize the land for Jewish Israelis while confining Palestinians to smaller and smaller enclaves in Israel proper, in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, and in Gaza, right? So that intent has been combined with inhumane acts. Again, I won't list all of the ones we found in the report, but they include the closure policy of Gaza that I just described. And it's all in the context of systematic oppression. Again, I laid out some of those elements. That led Human Rights Watch to reach the conclusion that the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution are taking place. All of what I just said was taking place on October 6th, 2023. Palestinians are facing war crimes, settlements, etc. War crimes, crimes against humanity, like apartheid and persecution. So post-October 7th. Again, I'm going to spend fewer minutes here because the introduction covered many of the abuses and many of you are familiar with that. But of course, on October 7th itself, Palestinian armed groups led by Hamas committed serious atrocities and war crimes in Israel proper. They included deliberate killings. We released a massive report several months ago methodically documenting the crimes committed by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. They include the taking of civilians as hostages, which are war crimes. We found evidence of acts of sexual violence. So there were very serious abuses carried out by Hamas and Palestinian armed groups on October 7th. Those have no justification, just as apartheid and Israel's other serious abuses have no justification. In Gaza, since October 7th, we have seen atrocities and abuses at a scale unprecedented in the modern history of Israel-Palestine. Again, I'm just going to cite them in brief. I'm happy to provide the citations, the data, the evidence in the Q&A, but I think you're very familiar with them. It starts with relentless airstrikes. According to the Gaza Ministry of Health data that we've reviewed and we find generally credible, more than 40,000, well over 40,000 Palestinians killed, thousands of children, women, the majority of those killed have been civilians. These airstrikes have targeted schools, they've targeted universities, hospitals, refugee camps, UN workers, journalists, simply at a scale that is difficult to conceive of. We have documented airstrikes that are war crimes that have hit where there's no apparent military target. We documented one strike in detail. For example, that struck a building. It killed 50 plus kids who were playing football outside, and many that were simply displaced or in homes that are around. It has reduced entire city neighborhoods and blocks to rubble. It has made parts of Gaza entirely unlivable. And we'll be releasing a report, I don't want to say too much about it, in the next couple of weeks that documents the extent to which Gaza has in effect been made unlivable, and documents the war crime of forcible displacement. You've had the majority of Gaza's population has been displaced, including virtually everybody in northern Gaza. Many people have been displaced many times over. The Israeli government has told people to go somewhere, bomb that area. They've been forced to go somewhere else. And this is a game where lives hang in the balance because people have been displaced and then killed where they've been displaced. They've been killed fleeing, seeking safety. Displacement, airstrikes. The Israeli government, from hours after October 7th, blocked the entry of fuel, of food, of aid, of medical supplies. Human Rights Watch from December of last year documented the use of starvation as a weapon of war, which is a war crime. We've documented collective punishment, which is also a war crime, punishing the entire population of Gaza for the crimes that were committed on October 7th. We have documented the use of white phosphorus by the Israeli government, which when used in densely populated areas is unlawful. We have documented the virtual destruction of the entire healthcare system in Gaza, unlawful attacks on hospitals, on ambulances. And this is, I can't emphasize this point enough, we've documented arrest, detention, and torture of doctors and healthcare workers, because if your health system is decimated, it means that even if you survive a strike, you may not survive the injuries sustained there, or even routine medical procedures if you're having a baby. if you're pregnant, if you need your dialysis treatment, if you need the most basic health care, it's not available in a triage situation. And remember, Gaza's been closed off from the international community for well over a year. Journalists haven't been allowed in, human rights advocates, the International Criminal Court. So the extent of the atrocities taking place, unfortunately, what I'm listing now may only be scratching the surface. I could go on and on about Gaza, but I want to emphasize that it's not just Gaza, right? On October 3rd of 2023, my colleagues at the UN delivered a presentation to the UN Human Rights Council warning of the unprecedented, find on our website, unprecedented repression in the West Bank. That was in fact what was happening in the West Bank. And that was a trend that went back to 2022 and the previous pre-Netanyahu government. But it's been accelerated on steroids. We are seeing settler violence at a level that we've simply not seen before. Entire communities are erased off the map. I'm not joking. I can point a map of the West Bank from 2014, and I can point to you to communities that are on that map that have been completely depopulated as part of, and this is not just extremist settlers. We, Human Rights Watch and other groups have documented the way in which settler violence is in fact state violence, because there's impunity for these crimes. Because the system is set up that way, because the state has used settlers and their presence in order to take control of land. Killings of Palestinians, hundreds of Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank. We've documented unlawful killings in the West Bank of kids, of adults, and settlement expansion is unprecedented. So again, I could go on and on and on, but the story is not just about Gaza, it's the West Bank. We're seeing repression of Palestinians inside Israel proper, legislation that would have seemed inconceivable several years ago. So all of this to say, and again, I want to sort of pause and emphasize this point, is there have been grave abuses of human rights in Israel-Palestine, as I started with on October 6th and before, including, of course, the events of 1948, 1967. But what we're seeing today is simply was unfathomable. I would have, I worked on this. I work on this every day. I've lived in the region. I could have never imagined this taking place. So again, let me take a step back. We're about halfway through the 4 points. We talked at first about the defense of the rules-based international order, the rallying cry around it, and secondly, the unprecedented repression that we're seeing on the ground today, and the ways in which it's not just about October 7th being the cutoff, that there was much of this was happening already before then. So the third cluster of issues I want to talk about is about the unique legal architecture and landscape taking place. And again, each one of the issues I'm about to talk about, I could do a whole lecture on, so I'm going to really do it in brief, but I'm happy to dive more in Q&A. So I'm going to focus on 3 proceedings. I'm going to mention a couple in the end that really are unprecedented and unique when it comes to international law in Israel-Palestine. The first, and maybe the one that's on the tip of your mind, was mentioned in the introduction, is the International Court of Justice proceedings around genocide, right? So let me just lay a little bit of foundation for those who are not familiar. So the Genocide Convention is a convention under which signatories, which includes Israel, have a recourse if 2 states have a dispute to go to the International Court of Justice, which is the world's highest court, to arbitrate about violations to the Genocide Convention. So South Africa brought a case against Israel for violations of the Genocide Convention many months ago, alleging that the Israeli government in its conduct in Gaza was committing genocidal acts, violating the Genocide Convention. They said this is a dispute because South Africa is also a signatory to the Genocide Convention. They had raised their concerns before. The Israeli government had failed to address them, so they went to the International Court of Justice, in essence, to seek a hearing on whether or not the Israeli government is in fact violating the Genocide Convention and committing genocide against Palestinians. Now, the International Court this is not the first time the International Court of Justice has heard a case like this. As I noted before, there are proceedings around genocide in regards to Myanmar in front of the International Court of Justice. And so there is some precedence for this kind of proceeding. So what's happened with this case? These cases take years, but there's already been a lot of activity. So the first thing that South Africa did, besides filing the case, is to call for the implementation, the imposition of what are called provisional measures. Provisional measures are the equivalent of an injunction in a US court, right? So basically what they've asked is they've said, we believe that the very rights we're seeking to vindicate could be eliminated while we're hearing this case. So we want the court to take some very basic steps in order to protect Palestinians from genocide and in order to preserve the ability to hear the case. They've filed several different requests for provisional measures, and the court has in fact imposed provisional measures. These are binding orders because this is the world's highest court. They've included measures that have been around different things, from simply preserving evidence to steps around Israel's very conduct, ordering Israel not to violate the Genocide Convention, ordering them to not use starvation as a weapon of war, to allow aid to enter, to very strong language around Israel's Rafah incursion many months ago. Now, again, this is the nature for the non-lawyers in the room of international law. These are binding orders, but enforcement doesn't always take place because there isn't a global police that'll go around and enforce these orders. But again, back to the question, do human rights matter? They matter because now you have, in many states, again, going back to my first point, defended the International Court of Justice in these other proceedings, right? Canada, et cetera, making proceedings, making submissions when it came to Myanmar, saying that these provisional measures are even Germany, a very close ally of Israel, saying that the court's opinions must be respected, but they're obviously not being respected. The Israeli government continues to violate these orders. So at the same time that these provisional measures, and this is ongoing, South Africa has gone back to the court several times, Israel has replied, the court has issued additional measures in a few instances. At the same time, the hearing on the merits continues. If you're following the news, you know recently South Africa made their evidentiary submission to the court. Israel next year will be given the chance to respond to the substantive, the claims of the South African government, and ultimately the International Court of Justice will issue a decision about whether or not Israel is violating the Genocide Convention. This is hugely significant, right? I mean, you have South Africa, a state that shook off the shackles of apartheid. I'm not saying things in South Africa are perfect. I've spent time there. Confronting Israel, an ally of the West, on the crime of genocide under the Genocide Convention at the world's highest court. I mean, it is an earthquake in international law, and it's an earthquake on Israel-Palestine. Now, what will happen? That hangs in the balance, right? We don't know how the court's going to rule. We don't know how, we know that the Israeli government, and Human Rights Watch others have found it, have violated the provisional measures, but the court isn't necessarily going to say that. I mean, they've implied it in their decisions until they make the rulings on the merits. But this is quite significant because it puts states like Germany, I go to Germany because it's maybe after the United States, one of Israel's closest 3 or 4 allies in the world, in the crosshairs, because Germany says we respect the court's decision. So it's very, very significant. So that's one proceeding, and I'm happy to answer questions about it in the Q&A. The second proceeding, and it gets much less attention, but actually in some ways it might be more significant, is the second proceeding at the International Court of Justice. And again, this was referenced in the introduction, which is the advisory opinion around Israel's occupation. So in simple terms, Palestine and many other states in late 2022 went to, at the UN, requested the International Court of Justice to issue an advisory opinion. Now, this is different than the genocide case in that the order is not binding because the court is not hearing an adversarial proceeding. It's not a proceeding between South Africa and Israel. It is a request from states of the UN because in addition to being the world's highest court, the International Court of Justice is also the UN court in essence. So they've been asked to advise the international community about the legal status and the consequences of Israel's occupation. Now, this took place in late 2022. In 2023, the court invited states to make submissions. 57 states made submissions. Human Rights Watch, we put out a statement saying we did the research. This is more states that have participated in any proceeding in the history of the International Court of Justice, a history that goes back to the end of World War II. So states heavily invested in that process. There were oral proceedings that took place at the International Court of Justice, which were unique. Many states spoke, and it was fascinating. Half the states, half the 57, said that Israel's committing apartheid, including the African Union, including the Arab League, including the OAS, the group of Muslim countries. I'm forgetting the acronym, but Organization of Islamic Conference. So you had all these different bodies making submissions. The court issued its opinion recently, and it's quite significant, not only finding that the occupation is unlawful, but also finding that Israel's committing apartheid. Now, the language of the opinion, you have to kind of parse that out, but Human Rights Watch, our reading of it is that the court actually upheld that Israel's committing the crime of apartheid. In addition, the opinion asked the court about what states should do in the face of this legal status of the occupation. There were very strong recommendations when it comes to importing goods from settlements and the obligations of states to take action to avoid complicity in serious abuses and ultimately to take steps to end the occupation. This is a very significant opinion by the world's highest court, not binding, but still setting very clearly the legal foundations and principles that states need to follow when it comes to not only self-determination, but when it also comes to principles around settlements, international humanitarian law, apartheid. So really a significant, weighty legal opinion. It was only the second time the ICJ, I'm putting the genocide case aside, had ever issued an advisory opinion on Palestine. The only other time was in 2004 when it came to the separation barrier, the wall, which the court then found to be unlawful and called for it to be dismantled. And what I want to emphasize is that you might say, Omar, what does it matter? Again, human rights doesn't matter. The court issued its opinion, the occupation hasn't ended, it's not close to ending, but it's important to understand the arc of impact takes some time. So I'll give you an example. The wall opinion was in 2004. The BDS movement, the movement of boycott, divestment, sanctions, was founded on the 1-year anniversary of that opinion. So to judge whether or not that opinion has value, we can't make that determination today. There might be action taking place at the UN in the months and years ahead. We already see movements in places like Ireland, bills that are looking to ban the import of settlement goods. So we may well see the impact arc on that opinion take time. The third proceeding I want to highlight, and again was mentioned in the introduction, is the International Criminal Court's review of the situation in Palestine. So again, let me provide some foundation for the International Criminal Court and where it is today. How am I doing on time, by the way? We're okay? Okay. So I can talk about all these until tomorrow morning, but I won't subject you all to that. So International Criminal Court. Let me take a step back for the non-lawyers in the room. International Criminal Court came into existence in 2002 following the Rome Statute. Well over 100 states have signed on to the Rome Statute. The International Criminal Court does not have automatic jurisdiction everywhere in the world. Jurisdiction only comes in several different ways, mainly by consent. So when states accede to the Rome Statute and agree that the court has jurisdiction over the territory, or it can happen by Security Council referral. In the case of Palestine, in 2015, the state of Palestine acceded to the Rome Statute. So in essence, it said that it accepts the jurisdiction of the court in Palestine, being West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. That triggered the then prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, to open a preliminary inquiry into whether or not crimes that fit within the mandate of the court are taking place in Palestine. Now, the mandate of the court really only applies to very serious crimes like war crimes and crimes against humanity. To summarize, again, boil down to still many years of history, in, I believe, late 2019, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court found that there was a reasonable basis to find that crimes are being committed in Palestine, and that she was going to open a formal investigation. But before doing so, she asked the court whether or not Palestine was sufficiently a state for the purpose of jurisdiction. Probably when I said Palestine acceded, you might be like, well, is Palestine a state? I mean, that thought process may have gone to your head. So Bensouda said, to make sure I cross my T's and dot my I's, I'm going to ask the court its opinion on this question. The court came back in early 2021, finding that Palestine, yes, is sufficiently a state for the purposes of jurisdiction. That's not based on some, if you guys have studied maybe in the political science department, the elements of sovereignty. They didn't go into that. It was based simply on the fact that the UN and majority of countries in the world have accepted the statehood of Palestine. Therefore, that's enough for them to move forward with jurisdiction. Okay, So that then triggered the prosecutor to open a formal investigation. That formal investigation was opened in 2021. Now you might ask, Ahmad, which crimes was the court looking into? Well, based on when it was at the state of preliminary inquiry, right, that was between 2015 and 2019, the prosecutor issued status reports on her inquiry. And then at that point, it seemed the investigation was largely focused on the successive rounds of military hostilities in Gaza. That was, again, mostly 2014, 2021, these different proceedings over the years, 2012, and settlements as a war crime. Of course, October 7th came, things shifted. We didn't have any update for many years on the court. And then finally, the week after I went on my parental leave and sabbatical, though I was called back into duty, the court issued arrest warrants. And again, this was explained in the introduction. Arrest warrants were issued against two senior Israeli government officials, Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, as well as three senior Hamas officials, two of whom have since been assassinated for serious crimes committed since October 7th. And they include crimes against humanity, war crimes of various natures. Now, very important point. Requested, that's what I was going to clarify, that the prosecutor requested the issuance of arrest warrants. Now, the court has the role to play to review that request. Generally, it's been a rubber stamp, usually a procedure that takes, again, timelines always vary with international institutions, but usually it's a month, 2-month process. We've been waiting now, I think 6 months almost, for the court to issue those warrants. We don't know what the delay is, what's behind the delay. One thing that did happen was the UK and several states asked if they could make submissions on the issuance of arrest warrants. Normally that's a type of process that would take place later on, but the court accepted and allowed these states to make submissions. Israel made a submission, so presumably that process has delayed the court issuing its arrest warrants. But that could be issued at any point. We don't know. And again, the court's history suggests they will authorize the issuance of arrest warrants. Now, if the arrest warrants are issued, that means all states that are signatories to the Rome Statute will be bound legally to arrest those individuals should they show up on their territory. And again, a number of these includes many Europe. The U.S. is not a signatory. We can get into that later. I know we have U.S. historians here who can probably answer that question better than me. But other countries, including major European, I mean, Netanyahu can't shop in Paris if these arrest warrants are issued, right? And if they're followed. Now, again, there's a history of Putin, for example, also has an arrest warrant, and many states have made decisions whether or not to actually allow him in or not. But that would be on the table. Now, this isn't the end-all, be-all. This indictment was not for all crimes committed in Palestine. They focused on October 7th with Hamas, and they focused on Israel's, mostly their use of starvation, other crimes in Gaza. The prosecutor has said the investigation is ongoing. It's possible additional crimes and officials will be charged. Now, I'm still within the third bullet of my introduction. I'm going to just, in a minute, say a couple of other things that are happening that are also unprecedented, right? Arms, many countries have paused or frozen the shipment of arms to Israel. Others have initiated reviews. In places like the United States, that arguably in a limited way has happened, but there's at least been debate that's somewhat unprecedented in the U.S.-Israel relationship regarding U.S. arms. And so that's unique, also unprecedented. And the United States, the UK, the EU, Canada have issued sanctions against settlers that are involved in violence in the West Bank. Again, something that's unique. So let me wrap up this point by saying, tell you where we are in the lecture, right? Defense of the rules-based international order, unprecedented atrocities and abuse, and unprecedented legal proceedings, and these other couple of things I mentioned. So my last point, which is much shorter, and then I'll move towards wrapping up, is the consensus around the nature of Israel's treatment of Palestinians. And this predates October 7th, but it's taken on steroids since October 7th. Now, as again was noted in the introduction, and I mentioned earlier, more and more voices have recognized that Israel's treatment of Palestinians amounts to apartheid. 27 Israeli human rights groups use the term apartheid in a joint statement the first day of the Netanyahu government to describe Israel's treatment of Palestinians. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Palestinian human rights groups, Several prominent UN experts, special rapporteurs on this question have reached that determination as well. Harvard Law School's Human Rights Clinic has reached that determination. And it's not just legal scholars. Lawrence Tribe, others have said the same thing. It's gone beyond, that. You have senior former Israeli government officials. You have the former Israeli Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, the former head of Israel's foreign ministry, former Israeli ambassadors to South Africa, all of whom have said that Israel's treatment of Palestinians amounts to apartheid. I've personally briefed Ban Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General. He came out and also said that Israel's treatment of Palestinians amounts to apartheid. So you have, and it's former foreign ministers, but it's gone beyond even individual government officials. You now have states, as I noted, and a minute ago with the ICJ proceedings, you had nearly 24 states and bodies, the African Union that represent many dozens of countries that have described Israel's treatment of Palestinians as apartheid. This is a significant and seminal moment. And when I say global consensus, obviously it doesn't include governments in Western and Europe and in the United States when it comes to the question of consensus. But there's a consensus in the human rights movement, and it's gone beyond to civil society, and now it encompasses the global South, right? That is hugely significant. And it's not just that there's this difference of opinion. As I noted with the genocide case, South Africa has called the bluff of the international community. It's gone to the world's highest court and said, we charge you with genocide. So that is hugely significant because in essence, what South Africa has said, not just South Africa, what all these other countries have said, right, is in essence, do you care more about the rules-based international order or protecting an ally like Israel? That question, that is raising the gun to the forehead of the global North and making them choose between these two monumental things. What matters to you? Are you going to continue to rally around human rights and international law? Because your credibility is sinking. I recall, and I'll tell you this anecdotally, I recall in 2022, early 2023, we would have global calls with our global because Human Rights Watch, and I can talk more about our structure and how we work, we have researchers that are like me, and we have advocates. Our advocates take the research we publish and are in Brussels, in New York, in Washington, D.C., in Cape Town, in Rio de Janeiro, pushing our work to get changes in policy. And I still recall our advocates in Geneva trying to rally our advocates in Brazil and South Africa and India saying, hey guys, we really want to push for action against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Can you support us by pushing your capitals? And what they would get back from our advocates in the global South is, our interlocutors are saying, why should we do this when the West is not doing the same thing on Palestine, right? And that question has become magnified 100-fold. So do human rights matter? Well, we have this moment now of unprecedented challenge and opportunity. So let me sort of move towards concluding. And what I want to say is, and I really do want to start with the situation on the ground. And again, coming to a college campus, and I want to echo the thanks, to the administration for allowing conversations like this to take place. I've covered many countries, as I know in the introduction. I've been kicked out of 4 countries for my work, and so I appreciate always the chance to present our research and to have discussions around that. But I want to say very clearly to you, especially if those of you in the room are new to Israel-Palestine, is there are some basic truths about the reality on the ground. And I'll just say a few of them because there's so much misconception when it comes to the discourse in the United States. The first is a nearly 60-year occupation is not temporary, right? Basic fact. Fact 2, right? Denying Palestinians their basic rights solely because of who they are is not simply a matter of an abusive occupation. This goes beyond that. Third, a 35-year peace process will not on its own, even if it was operating, and there has been no peace process for well over, no matter what calculus you use, a decade, and many would argue 25 years, will not alone anywhere in the world dismantle systemic repression. And maybe most significant, actually, before I get to that, my friend Hagai Elad, the head of the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, has said that democracy is the rule of the people, not the rule of one people over another. which is what we see in Israel-Palestine. And finally, and more fundamentally, and most importantly when it comes to college campuses, a daily reality of structural violence, a system methodically designed to ensure the domination of one people, Jewish Israelis, over another, Palestinians, is not simply a conflict between two equal parties or sides, right? There is a reality of structural violence, there's an occupation, there's a reality of crimes being committed every single day. The first step to solving any problem is to diagnose it correctly, right? Whether you're a doctor or an engineer, you know the wrong diagnosis leads to the wrong set of actions. What we're seeing today on the ground, undeniably, is a reality of apartheid. There are mass atrocities being committed. Many are raising the questions of genocide, which are really important questions being heard by the International Court of Justice, which is hearing that. We are seeing today unprecedented repression, but there are also these unprecedented opportunities to challenge that repression, to change the reality on the ground. There is the defense of the rules-based international order meeting the consensus in the global south. The fate of human rights in Israel-Palestine, the fate of whether or not human rights matters in Israel-Palestine much more globally, hangs in the balance. And I'm reminded that looking at an audience of young people today, and what I'll say to you is that today I answer the question that it still matters. It's hard to say that when I look at, when I've been 13 months of what's happening and all that's been happening before that, they do still matter. But if we don't reverse course, if there isn't action to change the atrocities, to deal with the apartheid, to deal with the mass atrocities, we are threatening the future of human rights in Israel-Palestine and across the globe. Thank you.
So, some students I think have to go, some folks have to go, and thank you all for attending. I'm going to ask Omar if he'll just say a few words about possible internships, what careers in human rights are like, to make sure I fulfilled the mandate of the lecture series, as our people who are collecting cards are walking around and can collect your cards, and I'll start to go through them. But let me have Omar talk a little bit about careers in human rights first.
Yeah, and I'm happy to answer more concrete questions. But I mean, look, I think the first thing is to say that my coming of age as a human rights lawyer began at university. It began with attending events. I still remember doing that. Organizing events. I was very much an organizer of student group events. Getting to know professors that worked on the Middle East and not just Israel-Palestine. I worked on Egypt and Pakistan and Syria and many other places. But I would just encourage you, as you're a student, the first thing I would do is take advantage of the opportunities you have here on campus. You have some incredible faculty. I've already met some of them that are just fountains of knowledge. I would encourage you to do research, to try and visit if you can. There's nothing like seeing Israel-Palestine for yourself. Human rights groups like Al-Haq, Al-Haq's the Palestinian Human Rights Group, they do a International Law Institute over the summer. So if you have a summer free, you could go actually to Ramallah and work with a human rights group and study and learn about the situation on the ground. And you can work for other local human rights organizations. Sometimes you get much more substantive experiences. That said, we at Human Rights Watch do have an internship program. There are opportunities to do that. I encourage you to check out our website. We're organized by division. So I'm a part of the Middle East North Africa division. I'm the Israel-Palestine director, but we have a division that work on thematic issues, LGBT rights, women's rights, health and human rights, disability rights. And each of these divisions, many of them do have internship programs. Some of them are ones that require you to be based in one of our offices. We do have an office in Washington, D.C. We have one in New York. Some of them are more flexible and involve doing work remotely. So definitely encourage you to check that out. But I also, just want to sort of emphasize that I didn't, my first job at Human Rights Watch was as a fellow out of law school. So I really do encourage you to make the most of your experience on campus. And I really think that's, I still have relationships I formed as a student that have stayed with me, in this current role. So maybe that's a short answer, but I'm happy to say a lot more about that if of interest.
So thank you to the student who said you're interested in a career in human rights. I hope the first thing you'll do, in addition to listening to Omar, is enroll in the Human Rights and History minor and reach out to me so we can talk about how to get you the internship of your dreams. That would be the first thing. Okay. Lots of really good questions here. Let's start with, and some of them kind of overlap, so if I don't get to your specific wording, if it kind of overlaps with another question, I have sort of encompassed it in that. What does it matter if the ICJ and the ICC issue orders saying Israel is committing apartheid or genocide if it isn't being enforced? People are still dying. Israel is still receiving many weapons and support. Will Israel face actual consequences, and what might they be?
Wow, that's like someone hit the nail right on the head of, of the question. That's a great question, right? All I can say is you kind of have to take a step back, and I know some of you study history, some of you study other fields, and you have to remember the world we live in, right? The world we live in, international law is not domestic law. International law is still, the International Criminal Court came to existence 2 decades ago. The international legal system is still based around the premise of state sovereignty. Human rights is still very much it doesn't yet have the kind of enforcement we would like. But do not confuse lack of enforcement for the lack of the binding power of these courts. So what do they matter? They matter ultimately as a tool that can be part of creating pressure to change that reality. Now I encourage many of you, if you haven't already, there's a great book by Professor Noura Erakat. She teaches at Rutgers. She wrote a book about this question exactly of international law in Palestine. And she, in that book, I'm forgetting the name of the book.
Justice for Some.
Justice for Some. She describes the law as like a sailboat, right? And I think it's a great analogy because it's like a reference point, but the ways in which it sails depend on whether or not political movements, civil society groups, states ultimately are able to then translate that into action. And unfortunately, that's the world we live in today. So let's be very specific. International Criminal Court may any day now issue arrest warrants, right? Those can matter, right? We've seen historically, study history. Look at Hassan Habareh of Chad. My colleague at Human Rights Watch tracked him down until he was eventually arrested and eventually, faced justice for the crimes that were committed. Now, if that happens, that will create momentum for states like, again, I keep going to Germany, France, who have said they are signatories to the Rome Statute, that they will follow the court's order. They now have a legal duty to arrest Netanyahu if he shows up on his territory. I promise you, Netanyahu is not going to show up in Paris if there's a 1% chance he's going to get arrested. That's something, right? Because it's not only about whether or not he gets arrested. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is create a kind of pressure, right? Because a state like Israel, and again, states have different motivations. I was talking earlier about my wife actually used to cover Syria for Human Rights Watch. And, Bashar al-Assad may not be similarly concerned about whether or not he can, shop in Paris. Actually, he might.
But his wife might.
His wife might, I was going to say. But the reason I say that is, is when you have arrest warrants, you become more of a pariah. And that's something that ultimately can, over time, create a kind of pressure and momentum. I don't want to go too long because I know there are more other questions, but I want to give you an example, an anecdote about this. I have often gone to meet governments with Hagai Elad. He's an Israeli human rights activist, used to run B'Tselem, one of my closest friends. And I remember we were sitting in a meeting in Europe, in Brussels. I can't remember which EU official. And he was asked a version of that question. He's like, well, why don't you just in the elections elect somebody else? And Hagai, as an Israeli, responded by saying, you want me to have a chance in my society? Make it costly for the status quo to continue. Because if there's no consequence, if Israel can kill, can expand their land without consequence, if you're a rational Israeli voter, why would you vote for anything other than the most extreme version of that ideology? If you can do it, get more land, get more wealth, get more without any consequence. So Hagai said, for me as an Israeli activist, I need the pressure, the rulings, the different arms decisions, sanctions, because ultimately that will help me have a chance to change my society to make different distinctions. I know that's not satisfying, right? All of us, many of us probably open Twitter, open the news and see every day, as we're speaking today, we probably have a Palestinian family that was killed. You see about 70, 80 a day, I'm just ballparking many different figures that are being killed, right? And you want something to be done. The ICC and ICJ, they're not going to end apartheid with one ruling, right? But again, it's part of creating more of a normative legal basis, but also providing tools that people like you, human rights activists, advocates can use to advocate for change. That's the best answer I can offer you, and it comes back to my thesis, which human rights matters, yes, but if we don't act, maybe it won't matter in 10, 15 years.
So this would be a more critical take. Why does Human Rights Watch get criticized for not giving as much attention to autocratic, non-democratic countries and their much hidden human rights abuses as to Israel, which is the only democratic country in the Middle East and allows its own self-criticism with regard to its own long-term survival?
So I'll say several things. One is, so I said I've been kicked out of 4 countries. Israel was the 4th of those countries. I was blocked from entering Syria because I wrote things the Syrian government didn't like. I wrote a report on the Rabaa massacre in Egypt, which got me kicked out of Egypt. I was blocked from entering Bahrain because of Human Rights Watch's years of work on Bahrain. Just like I'm here talking about Israel-Palestine, my wife covered Syria, and I have colleagues that cover every country in the Middle East and North Africa. We cover 100 countries around the world. We write hard-hitting reports all the time on all of those countries. I mean, just like I've been banned from 4 countries, many of my colleagues have been banned from many of those other countries as well. We treat Israel-Palestine the very same way we treat all those other countries. The same amount of attention, the same methodology, the same focus. It's not just about me. Again, as I said, look at our website. Every single day we're writing reports. My wife was barred from entering, Syria herself as well. So all this is to say, I think that question simply just ignores the reality of the nature of our work. And again, we're unique in that we have this global mandate. But even if, right, somebody just were to work on Israel-Palestine, that doesn't make them, biased any more than a Tibetan activist that works on, Tibet and China would be anti-Chinese or anti-Asian, right? And so I think it's important, and I think it's important to recognize that, yes, there are critics inside Israel. There are critics that are in newspapers. There are critics in the human rights community, but they're also under attack. Right? I mean, as was noted, I was deported by the Israeli government. Not just about me. Israel has criminalized 6 of Palestine's most prominent human rights organizations. They have arrested human rights defenders. They have deported Palestinian human rights defenders. They have imposed travel bans on them. They've bombed the homes and offices. They've raided the homes and offices of them. So yes, Jewish Israeli critics have a limited space, although they'll tell you it's limited. They've been called traitors, and including at the UN. They've been attacked in the newspapers. They've been threatened. They've had undercover people, some with the government, some without, infiltrate their organizations. So yes, they're under attack. But again, I'll refer back to what Haggai said. I said in my remarks, democracy is the rule of the people, not the rule of one people over another. I'll let you all study the facts of Israel-Palestine and make your own determination about whether the democracy characterization is accurate or not.
You said in an interview, so somebody's obviously done their homework on you. You said in an interview with Forbes on October 16th, 2023, in the context of Hamas's responsibility to abide by international law, that, quote, "The minute you allow for exceptions is the minute that," I guess it must have been it, because the person wrote, that the international rules-based order loses all meaning, end quote. Israel has enjoyed unmitigated impunity with regard to making exceptions for itself. So how do we now restore meaning to these conventions when it has been so thoroughly demolished?
I don't think they've been demolished. That's where I would disagree. I think they're at a moment, look, I mean, candidly, all of these institutions are facing really significant moments of challenge. I mean, look at the prosecutor, right? If you've been reading the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, he's now facing allegations of sexual misconduct. The previous prosecutor was sanctioned by the Trump administration. There have been death threats issued against them. All of these institutions faced a fundamental question about whether or not they're going to apply the same rules to Israel that they apply everywhere else in the world or not. I actually think these institutions have largely risen to the challenge, right? The ICC issued arrest warrants. The ICJ issued
Requested.
Requested, sorry. requested the issuance of arrest warrants. The ICJ issued a very strong advisory opinion. The ICJ has issued very strong provisional measures. I could nitpick some of the decisions, right? I mean, I think the ICJ judges, and again, this is for the lawyers in the room that are in the weeds of legal minutia. I think they tried to get as wide a number of judges on there, so it looked near unanimous, and that caused them to, I think, water down their language in the provisional measures order more than some would like, but they're still absolute huge moments. So they have risen to the occasion. Who has not risen to the occasion? States that have the power. The United States, the Biden administration in particular, countries in Western Europe, they have not risen to the occasion. That's where the failure ultimately lies, because these institutions, yes, they're significant, but they're not, they can't operate. I mean, the ICJ is in the world's court, but here's disputes between states, right? And you need states to ultimately act on these opinions. So I would argue that these institutions have, for the most part, risen to the challenge. They're not making that's October 16th. We didn't know. I mean, that's why I said that to Forbes, I guess, is we didn't know how the ICJ, we didn't know. I mean, would the IC issue request arrest warrants? Would the ICJ issue a strong advisory opinion? Would the ICJ, would a genocide? We didn't know those answers. I think they've largely done an effective job within their restrictions and mandates. Now, that hasn't stopped the reality on the ground. But the failure of that is first and foremost with the Israeli government, and secondly with those states that are complicit in those atrocities. They have failed. That failure is a moral abomination on those governments, and is one that could well change the future of human rights, as I've tried to say pretty dramatically in this presentation. And it's not. Maybe I'll say one anecdote, just because I don't want you to think that the people in power don't understand the significance of the moment they're in. There was an interview that I remember Secretary of State Anthony Blinken did with an Israeli newspaper on one of his many visits to Israel. And I remember reading it because it stuck with me, where he said, and I can't remember if it was a direct quote of him, I'll have to look up the citation, or if it was somebody saying he said this in a meeting, so please check the sourcing. But the account that was relayed was Blinken told an Israeli interlocutor that he will spend the rest of his life having nightmares about the images of dead Palestinian kids. This didn't make widespread press, but the point of raising this is, I think, even where institutions like the Biden administration have failed, and they have unquestionably failed, and Kamala Harris may well lose an entire election. I just spent some time in Michigan. I can tell you that whatever you read in the news, I'm not so sure it'll go the way that some say it will go because of this issue. But not just because of that, I really do think that the weightiness of the moment we're in is weighing on people, and it's in part because of the voices of students that we're at this moment. And what happens, the history has not been told. If you look at the history of Israel-Palestine, read the book, The Only Language They Understand by Nathan Thrall. If you look at the first Intifada, Oslo came 6 years later, 87, 93. So what happens in Israel-Palestine, don't just look at where we are 1 year later, it's where we are 5 years later, 7 years later. There may not be a Gaza, or may not be people of Gaza if we don't act quickly, but the arc of what might happen, we're still early in that journey. Sorry for the long answer.
No, it's okay. This question is going to require you to revisit a couple things you just said and clarify. And I want to make sure to give you the opportunity to clarify, because the question says, because facts matter, and I don't want to be considered as not including all of the tough questions. I want to make sure I include them here. Because facts matter, apartheid involves an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination of one racial group committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. Israeli Arabs enjoy full equal rights and hold government positions. It is dangerous and anti-Semitic to mainstream hate and lies by using lay terms to invent a new definition for those of us that are not lawyers, quote unquote.
Was there a question?
The question is, can you clarify what apartheid is, or what I infer from this, and do Israeli Arabs enjoy full rights, which speaks to the issue of whether or not Israel is a full democracy?
So for those, read our 217-page report that I wrote on this, because we do, it's hard for me. That was, subpoint of a subpoint of a subpoint of this lecture, so I was trying to summarize that report in simple terms. There are two definitions of apartheid, mainly, right? One comes from the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court, which importantly uses the word institutionalized regime of racial oppression. There's another definition in the Convention on the Elimination of Apartheid, signed by 100 states, which does not use the word regime. So what we at Human Rights Watch did, because we're not a legal court, we essentially, those definitions overlap 90%. They mainly include three elements. You can read the exact wording of the definition. Systematic oppression, a regime is another word for systematic. If you ever opened a dictionary before, it's the same thing. You call it a regime or call it systematic oppression, same thing, right? You need an oppression by one group over another. You need what are called inhumane acts, which refer to a number of serious abuses. They include things like forced displacement, mass land expropriation. There are many others. And third, you need an intent to maintain the regime or system of domination. And again, the report goes in great depth of where we reach this finding. So the questions about Israeli Arabs, and I put that between air quotes because we use the term in our report, Palestinian citizens of Israel. Israeli Arabs is a term I think often used to dilute the Palestinian identity of those who live inside Israel proper. They make up about 20% of the population. So vis-a-vis, of course, if you're going to compare their rights with those in Gaza and the West Bank, yes, they have some rights that are better than their brethren in Israel Palestine. But let me give you several examples of the very serious discrimination and repression that they face. Maybe most fundamentally, they attend separate schools that have very different resources. The Palestinian citizens of Israel make up about 20% of Israel's population. They live largely, and I'm looking at Shira Robinson in the back, an expert who's written a great book on called Citizen Strangers. I encourage you to read it. It is, an incredible historical account of the status of Palestinian citizens of Israel. I would be remiss not to mention that. I learned a lot about what I know from that book. But largely live on about 3% of the land. They attend separate school systems, which have very different resources. Maybe most fundamentally, and again, citizen strangers go into this, the very nature of their legal status differs, right? Israel is not a state of the people who live there. It is the Jewish state. So people who are Jewish can basically automatically become citizens of Israel. So if somebody is American Jewish and just tomorrow decides to go to Israel, they can become a citizen, they can gain land. Palestinians do not have that same right. The majority of the Palestinians who were living in the land in 1948 were forced to flee or expelled from their homes in 1948. Palestinian refugees, they number several million. They're all around the region, around the world. They're denied that right to return. So a Jewish American can tomorrow move to Israel, become a citizen. A Palestinian who is languishing in a camp and their children and grandchildren are denied that right to return to where they're from solely because of who they are. Right, so it's not just the people, the rights of the people in there. It's the very right to be present, in that land. I mentioned the marriage ban. If a Palestinian citizen of Israel wants to marry another Palestinian from the West Bank or Gaza, they cannot give them. It's effectively impossible to give them legal status to live with them. I could go on and on and on, but the idea that they have equality is false. And don't even take me. The U.S. State Department annual human rights report talks about the many forms of discrimination that they face. And again, and the last point I'll make is when we talk about apartheid, what we're talking about is between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. I'm going to summarize for you how, if I were to describe in 3 sentences to a 9-year-old the situation in Israel-Palestine, I would say these 3 sentences in essence. Between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, you have 2 groups of people roughly equal size. Half of them are Jewish Israeli, half of them are Palestinian, right? And the Jewish Israelis are methodically privileged, and the Palestinians are, no matter where they live, discriminated against to different degrees of authority. But there is not 1 inch of land in which a Jewish Israeli and Palestinian are equal between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea.
Somebody's concerned that you've blamed the Biden administration and not the House, the Congress, the Senate. I don't think you can do anything about that. And by the way, the questions that are not specifically legal related, I'm not including because Amar is an international human rights lawyer, and it's only fair that we allow him to speak from his expertise and not ask him to talk about U.S. politics and whatnot.
Thank you.
But as a human rights advocate, somebody is asking, how would you have advised Israel to respond to the attacks made on October 7th?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I would have said, and anything, universally, uniformly, crimes, let me be very clear, and I said this in my presentation, I'll say it again, and Human Rights Watch has a 200-page report on the crimes that were committed on October 7th. Crimes were committed. That's a fact, right? There were deliberate killings of people, spraying into crowds, going into people's homes and killing them. There were civilians taken hostage. Absolutely atrocious, and that's undeniable. It's a fact. And like any other crime, there should be accountability. We called for the International Criminal Court to investigate, and they did. And they ultimately issued arrest warrants on those that they requested the issuance of arrest warrants. I'm projecting my wishes for the future with that consistent Freudian slip, for those involved in those crimes. So, our recommendation is quite simple, right? We're not going to we tell people, follow the law, right? International law allows, by the way, it allows the use of force. Don't think international law doesn't allow you to use military force, but they have very simple rules, right? And international humanitarian law is premised around basic principles: proportionality, right? Distinguish between civilians and military targets. If you're going to go after something that's a military target, make sure it's proportionate, that it's not like, you're killing hundreds of civilians for a low-level target. They have principles on the kinds of weapons you can use. So my advice would have been adhere to the law, right? And pursue justice and accountability for those that were implicated. That's the same recommendation I would make, by the way, not only for Gaza, but for the Palestinian Authority. I've written another 100-plus report, wasn't mentioned in my introduction, about arbitrary arrest and torture by the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. And the same thing we called for: accountability. We called for cutting arms, support for military support for the Palestinian security forces. It's the same toolkit and the same set of recommendations. And I think Israel, not only would that have been, the right thing legally, I think they would have had a lot of the world's support for those steps and those actions if they had acted in that way. Instead, they from the first minutes cut water, fuel, food that affect the entire civilian population of Gaza. The vast majority of them had nothing to do with the attacks of October 7th. We, in fact, issued a statement on October 9th, and I encourage you to read it. We had a Q&A. We put out a Q&A about the law and how it applies. 14 pages. I remember, putting that together on the day of October 7th and 8th. Read it. We have very clear guidelines about the law that had to be followed. So I know I sound like a broken record, but I would have said the same thing: respect the law. Pursue accountability for the crimes committed. And the same thing with Hamas. We said from the first day, release all civilians held hostage, right? Hostage taking is a war crime. We would have said the very same thing, and they would have had a lot more support for that globally if they didn't, initiate such atrocities in Gaza.
So we didn't really address this. You talked about the issue of starvation as a tool of war. But it may be worth noting, so somebody asked the question about UNRWA. I'm going to partly reshape the question. The question is, now that UNRWA has been banned, how will this affect international law? I think it's worth noting, or maybe you'll note, that this has been an Israeli law just this last week in which UNRWA has banned. What does that mean for international law and the international community as the primary provider of aid to Palestinians since 1950?
Yeah. That's another whole talk I could give, but let me start by saying, for those who are not familiar with the refugee legal regime or UNRWA, basically when 1948 happened, when the Nakba happened, you suddenly had more than 700,000 Palestinians who were forced to flee or expelled from their homes. And there sort of was an entire legal apparatus for refugees, but because of the nature of the Palestine situation, the states and the UN created a separate body, which is UNRWA. UNRWA basically existed to provide services primarily to Palestinian refugees and safeguard them until they were able to return to their homes, which under international law, refugees have a right to return to the lands that they were forced from and have maintained connections to. Israel has this fantasy that if they, defund UNRWA, if they delete UNRWA, they can suddenly delete the refugee status of Palestinians, but that's just wrong, right? And in fact, I think Israel probably has been surprised to see the extent to which not only European states, but even the United States, and people mentioned the House and Congress, that there have actually been efforts by many to maintain UNRWA. And by the way, it's not just these states. I mean, the Israeli security establishment understands the value of UNRWA, because if you have, I mean, again, I mentioned Gaza's majority refugees. Many live in refugee camps. If you're not providing them with education and health services and employment opportunities, that's a population that's going to be much more likely to resist, to protest, to cause trouble. So actually, Israeli security apparatus understands the value of having some sort of system for refugee populations in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They're certainly critical in Jordan and Lebanon, even to a degree in Syria, where they provide, services. So, the Israeli government, in a very unprecedented way, is facially challenging, and you've probably seen the news from today or yesterday. Days all blur into each other of, steps to revoke UNRWA's mandate. Again, it's another challenge because, what's the international community going to do? UNRWA was, okay, I mean, look, Israel has an easy solution. Let them return to their homes. If you don't want UNRWA, if Palestinian refugees have the right to return to their homes, we can dismantle UNRWA tomorrow. They'll have no purpose of existing. But clearly, the Israeli government isn't going to do that. So what's the international community going to do? Because UNRWA is there as a Band-Aid. You rip the Band-Aid, that doesn't change the legal status, the rights. States have said that as well. So it's yet another issue where this Israeli government is pushing red lines, pushing into uncharted territory. And what's the international community going to do? Statements, empty words, they've failed. They've not been enough to change the Israeli government from moving forward. You can't throw money at the problem. It's not a humanitarian issue. There's an underlying political objective here, and it's going to need a forceful response. And we haven't seen that. So I don't have a crystal ball, but I do think this is a challenge that not only affects the status of Palestinian refugees, but I also think it poses a security issue. And again, not only for Israel, for Jordan, for Lebanon, for states that have massive Palestinian refugee populations who have nowhere else to turn to. And these are 3 generations of refugees. If you've been to these camps, there are people that are, college age, whose parents were born refugees, whose grandparents, some of them, were forced to be refugees. Generations of people born into refugee status who have no political horizon and now are being threatened to lose the basic things they get, which is some health services, some education.
So the last question I'm going to skip because it asked you to prognosticate. What do you think the opportunity is that anybody will be held accountable for any of these crimes? But I think you said it's kind of all up for grabs, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, I am an optimist. I think to work in human rights, and again, I know this is the human rights in the field, series. So I will say to do this work, you have to be optimistic. It's hard, because how else are you going to get up and do it? And I have to say, the last year has challenged that optimism. It's been hard. It's been hard to do that. But I will say, if you had told me on October 6th, if you had taken the part of my talk that was about the unprecedented challenges, and you had showed that to me on October 6th, I wouldn't have. Sometimes I say words, and I'm like, I have this out-of-body experience. Like, could I have imagined myself sitting in a room and talking to you and saying some of the facts that we're seeing? Because I've been on leave now for several months. It's hard for me to still process that this is happening, and we've not seen the consequences that should follow from that action. On the other hand, I'm going to speak with the other side of my mouth, which is if you were to tell me on October 6th that the ICJ would have a case against Israel for genocide, provisional measures order, that we would have gotten the advisory opinion we've requested, that the arrest warrants would have been issued for Netanyahu and his defense minister. Requested. Damn it. I did it again. We should have like a bell dinging every time I do it. I will blame being on parental leave and having an infant at home and sleep deprivation. But, requested, if you had told me that major states, I'm not just talking about small states, European states, states like Canada have either stopped new arms transfers or are debating these, if you'd have told me there are sanctions for settlers and a regime in place that's building on it, if you're telling me that an entire political movement would have arisen in the United States, that a president might lose an election because of the perceived complicity in mass atrocity, I would have told you these things would have been beyond the pale of believability, credibility a year ago. So yeah, so I'm going to go back to the theme of my remarks, which is ultimately we do. And again, I keep saying this. I used to say Unprecedented Challenge and Opportunities before October 7th, and all of that went up 100x, maybe 1,000x or 10,000x, both the challenges and the opportunities. So will people face accountability? It depends what you define as accountability. I mean, I already think that that things have shifted in such a fundamental way on college campuses in the world, but they're happening on different timescales. The Israeli government is killing and displacing and grabbing up land at warp speed, and the tectonic plates of justice and accountability are moving at a much slower time horizon. So where does that go? The pessimist, if I had a pessimist next to me, would tell you by the time those wheels crank and turn fast enough, maybe I don't want to be, I don't want to think of the most negative outcome, historical outcome. Maybe that's what takes place, right? On the other hand, you could imagine this becoming untenable and these things building and over time there being, actual forms of accountability, whether it be more arms sales cut off, whether it be individual leaders facing criminal sanctions. But the arc of the moral universe is, what's the exact quote, is long, but it bends towards justice. So I believe that the shifts we're seeing on college campuses, that the shifts we're seeing in governments will lead to something. That's why I get up every morning, but I can't promise you that's the case. And ultimately, the way that the pendulum swings may depend on what you all do in the years to come.
Please join me in thanking Omar Shaker for joining us today and for enlightening us on a very challenging and difficult topic. Thanks again to the university for not creating no obstacles to our holding this session. I think that's a real mark of character of our president and the leadership of the university and of the College of Liberal Arts. So thanks again to them, and thank you, Omar, for joining us today.
Thank you.